Hey everyone, it's Mr. Wildboy94. I hope you're doing well today. I have another book review for you. This one is a particular book I've mentioned quite a bit here on the channel, and I finally got around tonight to making a recording of the review for this. It's been 10 years since I read this book. It's taken me months to read it, because I read the first 400 pages, and after that first 400, I just took a break for a long while. Finally got it back around to reading the other 500 pages to the book. That book is Robert McCammon's Swan Song. The first time I ever read this book, like I said, it was about 10 years ago, and it's a big old book too, 950 pages long, man, or 920. I think this copy is 920. I think my bigger paperback is 950. Swan Song, man, this is a powerful, powerful, beautiful book. One of the most poetic books I've ever read in my life. It's a post-apocalyptic story that starts right before the apocalypse, and this book, I don't even really have the right words for it. It's just a perfect book. Period. Plain and simple. A lot of people compare this to Stephen King's The Stand. Kind of both versions. And even the villain himself is very much like Randall Flagg from The Stand. And I kind of understand where people are coming from. But overall, I think at the end of the day, I would argue this is a better book than The Stand entirely. The Stand is a phenomenal book. At least the original version is. I don't really like the expanded and uncut version as much. I've read that 9 or 10 years ago too. About the time I read this, right before I read this book, I actually read The Stand's uncut version. I recently read for the first time ever the original version of The Stand, the 1978 version. I think that book's pretty much a perfect book. I would say that this is right up there with being a perfect book. It is a great book. I think it's better than The Stand. I think the overall tale is better. I like the execution of it. I think the journey is a lot better, even though The Stand is a powerful thing of its own right. Robert McCammon, I had never read until I read Swan Song. The only other book I've ever read from him entirely was Boy's Life, and Boy's Life is pretty good too. If you haven't read that, you should check that out as well. It's a lot shorter than Swan Song, but Swan Song, in my opinion, is his magnum opus at this current point of what I've read. I tried to read another one of his books. I think it was Sings the Nightbird or something like that. I tried to read it. I read a couple of chapters, lost interest back in the time. That was years ago. Haven't read it since. It's still sitting on my Nook. Yeah, my Nook. Not my Kindle, my Nook. It was on my old Nook from back in the day when Nooks were still popular. I like Robert McCammon's writing style. I think it's, again, very poetic. I think that he really hits something with these characters in this book. I don't even know where to start with this book, man. It takes place over the course of 8 years. Yeah, it gets a good stretch of time. This 950-page book starts off with all of these characters scattered all over the country, and the first chapter actually opens up with the President of the United States, basically in a situation in the midst of our Cold War going on. Basically, this whole post-apocalyptic situation outbreaks because the world decides to go into nuclear chaos and just starts shooting nukes off and stuff and atomic bombs or whatever at each other, and it decimates everything. It completely destroys everything on the entire planet. You have people for example, you have this young girl named Sue Wanda, aka Swan, that's her nickname. She and her mother are kind of on the run. They eventually come across after they run away from the mom's current boyfriend that abuses that young girl, Swan, who I love to death. Swan is one of the best characters, if not pretty much the main pivotal character of the entire book. The mom takes her away. They end up running into a fella at one point who is a big, muscular black guy named Josh, and Josh used to be a wrestler for a living, which is kind of cool. I've never seen something like that done in a book, ever. It was just a kind of a cornier type of career that you never really expected to see, but it was so neat seeing that in here. And Josh is kind of like the guardian figure of Swan throughout the book, and they kind of stick together the entire book to help each other out. And they have people they come across too. However, the President of the United States, of course, like I said, goes ahead and hits the button, and everybody at the different countries across the planet start blowing each other up. And once all that happens, and some people we follow right before, like Sister, and I'll talk about Sister in a moment as well, you have a situation where the whole world just ends. There's no sun anymore, just snow all the time. It's constantly cold. It's snowing constantly, pretty much. Not tons and tons and tons of it, but it's a consistent thing enough pretty much everywhere from what I understand that no one's seeing the sun at all. And over time, people start to grow these growths around their whole head. Sometimes it covers your whole head entirely, where you can't even do anything with it. You can't chop it off, it just grows back. It's a very hard thing. If you hit your head, usually you're going to be fine, because this thing is so thick. That's a disease. A lot of people call it Job's mask, kind of like in the Bible. There's a lot of biblical things tied into this book. It's not as biblical as Stephen King's The Stand, which is pretty much his own version of the Book of Revelation. It's not anything like that, but it kind of draws close to that. Like I said, even the main villain in here that's kind of the Antichrist, he's kind of his own Randall Flagg ripoff type of thing, which I don't really want to call it a ripoff. I mean, people have been doing the same thing over and over again for years. Of course, this book came out in '87, right before the re-release of The Stand, the uncut version. When it was first released, it came out in 1990. The original came out in '78, so almost 10 years later, this book comes out. I don't think it's fair to call it a ripoff. It's a fantastic book. It's so unique in a completely different way from The Stand that I don't think it's fair to call it a ripoff. It's a phenomenal book. Every single chapter of this book, this is one of the best books for an example of a book that's almost 1,000 pages long, but not a single chapter in here drags. Every single chapter, every single word in here actually matters. And it baffles me how people have not talked more about Swan Song and made a mini-series out of it, or a TV show, or anything like that. I don't know how somebody even like Netflix, as much as I can't stand Netflix, I'm surprised they or Hulu or somebody haven't jumped into trying to make this into an adaptation. I assume it'd be relatively costly. I assume so, or costly, whatever. But it would be, you'd get so much good return out of this if you would do a faithful, non-political version of it. You would get so much support based around this from the fans like myself who don't even want an account with something like Netflix. You guys are missing out, dude. I don't even know where to start. There's so much to talk about here, man. So some of the other characters you kind of follow before you go into the whole end of the world situation when all the nukes actually destroy everything. There's a big complex that's a military base that people that are basically rich pay to go live in. There's a young man named Roland Croninger who shows up here with his mom and dad. And he's I think I remember him being a very nerdy and geeky kid. He was very obsessed with the idea of like a Dungeons and Dragons, Arthur's Round Table, knighthood type of thing. He kind of considered himself wanting to be the knight of some sort and follow a king. And he kind of goes nuts. He's a younger guy. I think he is like 16 or something, but I think he might be younger, I don't know. But he kind of goes nuts. And there's another fellow that's involved in this military industry here named Colonel Macklin. And Colonel Macklin, man, he is a crazy, nutty dude. He has a lot of, I think he came out of the Vietnam War. I think that's what it was. And when he came out of the Vietnam War, he's had this thing called the Shadow Soldier that kind of is just like this personality split in his mind. Sort of, kind of. Not entirely, but sort of, kind of, where it's like it taunts him to do all these things, or it's kind of always nagging him to do evil things and whatnot. It kind of laughs at him, makes fun of him, that kind of thing. Again, kind of a split personality thing. Colonel Macklin's here too. And when the bombs get blown up all over the planet, he kind of gets trapped, and Roland has to free him. And at that point, the way they free him is chopping off Macklin's hand. From the beginning of the book, in the first like 30 or 40 pages, I mean, the book is gory. The book has a lot of gore in it. There's attempted rape scenes. There's a lot of stuff like that happen here, a lot of sexual content, but not in an extreme horror way, not in like an exploitation type of way. This is a very straightforward, very powerful, very, again, poetic novel. It's beautiful how it's written. It's just the scenes, the way they're described. I mean, Robert McCammon, there are people out there who have a way with words, like Stephen King, and I love that about Stephen King. As much as I think his books are filled with bloat, Robert McCammon gets directly to the point, but he can also just do wonderful Mad Max-like action scenes and tense poetic scenes. He can develop arguments and fights and battles and everything. He can just pull it all off. He can do every single bit of it, and there's a lot of a Mad Max kind of feel in here, too, because at one point in the story, we jump 7 years ahead of time, and everybody kind of grows up a little bit, everybody moves a little further into their life. And when that happens, you have a lot of folks who are learning how to live again, people who are growing up in all of this, who have never seen anything but the apocalypse. It's a crazy, crazy situation. Seeing some of these people change over these years and what they grow into, again, that illness with the Job's Mask thing is happening to people. It's a little crazy. It's a little crazy how things kind of go throughout this book. Watch people like just some of our main characters, like Roland or Macklin or Swan, Josh, all these people change over time. Sister, who's another character I haven't mentioned, we meet her right before the apocalypse thing happens. She's a homeless lady who's crazy, and I guess she had a daughter or somebody taken away from her at some point, is what I believe was mentioned. It was a long time ago when I started the book, so I forgot about a lot of the earlier parts of the book's details. But I remember she's homeless, and she has like a sort of semi-faith in God, I believe. And she wears a cross necklace, and when the bombs go off, she actually sees that and feels the heat, and the cross actually gets burnt to her actual skin, leaves a mark there. She's the first person to pretty much come across a guy that later on in the book he nicknames himself Friend, who is basically the Randall Flagg Antichrist figure. He is I'm pretty confident that unlike Randall Flagg, depending on what version of The Stand you're reading, you could debate with yourself on whether he's a demon, the devil himself, the actual Antichrist that's not the devil, but the Antichrist possessed by Satan, or just a dark magician. I believe the Dark Tower series explains what Randall Flagg is. In this book, it seems to me like a lot of the parallels that are drawn in here are pointing to that Friend, which is the nickname of this guy. I think he also goes by Doyle. He has a bunch of different names. I'm pretty confident he's supposed to be the devil, like the actual devil. And he's so sinister, dude. He's so sinister. He'll have like mouths that'll open up the side of his face, and he can shapeshift his face and body and stuff. He can change his voice, his eye color, all these things. He's also known as the Man with the Scarlet Eye. And the first time you get an introduction to him, it's one of the coolest villain intros, very much like Randall Flagg in the sense of being one of the most iconic intros I've ever seen. There's an old, scary, people thought it was real, movie back in the day called Faces of Death. And when the apocalypse has happened and whatnot, he's just sitting in an abandoned theater by himself, shape-shifting and stuff while he's watching Faces of Death on a theater screen by himself, cackling and laughing at it. It's a very gory thing if you don't know what Faces of Death is. This guy is so sinister and so evil. He's one of the best villains I've ever read. I love Randall Flagg because he's usually jokey, and then he becomes serious. This fellow here has a lot of those same personality traits, but I think he's more of a threat from beginning to end. Every time he's on screen, or you think he's on screen, because he shapeshifts, he could sneak up on people at different times in the book. Every time that you think he might be there, you're going to be a nervous wreck, probably, because he's just panic-inducing, because of the kind of things that he's capable of. Now, he's not like Randall Flagg in the sense that he can just jump from place to place. He has to travel on bicycles and that kind of thing. But some parts of this book are so deeply comedic in a very dark way. And I'm the kind of person I love that. That's my kind of humor. I love dark humor. This book has a lot of that. If you're that type of person that likes that kind of humor, like Better Off Dead with John Cusack, even though that's a comedy, not a serious movie or serious anything. If you like dark comedy, this book is going to be for you. And I think it has more of that than something like Stephen King's The Stand. Stephen King's The Stand, as much as I love it, is a very straightforward book. It has a lot of great personalities and characters and whatnot in there, so does this book. But this has a dark humor and a tone to it that really just shines out. And a lot of the time, one thing I feel that I picked up on this time, more that I've written over the years myself in my own personal life, trying to be a writer, it seems like every chapter is so satisfying because they feel more like they're short stories. Like each chapter feels like an actual short story, not the next chapter of this person going to this place. And it can be that, but also feel more like a short story. And it works. If you want to learn how to write a novel, take an idea from this book, from Swan Song, if you read the book. Every single chapter feels like an actual short story written out of a character at that particular moment. And you might pick up a story next time you see that character, another chapter, a few chapters later on, they might be doing something completely different. And like I said, at one point, the book skips to 7 years ahead. You're watching a lot of people change over time and what they've become 7 years later, what they're on a journey with. One of the coolest aspects of the book is that there's a little bit of magic in here. It's not just a straight-up supernatural or just a straight-up realistic type of story with the devil being involved. It is more realistic, I think, and less supernaturally involved the way something like The Stand is. The Stand is very Bible-based, very Christian-focused, even, I would say. As a Christian myself, I love that about it. This book is not so much that. It has a little bit of that in there, but there's a little bit of a magic aspect too. For example, Sister, the homeless woman I talked about, comes across a bunch of like jewels that got melted together, or sand or something that got melted together when the nukes went off, and they made like this, almost a circle with spikes sticking out around it. And it kind of becomes her thing that she has to hold on to and protect, because she can also see visions in this thing that kind of lead her to where she needs to go in the future. And she comes across other characters too that I love, named Paul. Paul is a great character. I really enjoy him. Probably the least memorable of the many characters. I had forgotten about Paul, but I always remembered Sister, Josh, and Swan when I would read this book, or like the Antichrist character, or Roland and Colonel Macklin. I remember all those main characters, but Paul, for whatever reason, I had forgotten over the years since the last time I read this book. And reading it this time around, rediscovering characters like that, I really love that about him. Paul is such a cool, loyal guy. Of course, you have a lot of other characters that come in here, too, I don't want to talk about because there's so many floating around throughout the book, man. This big old 950-page book, man, you have so much in here. So many iconic moments, whether it be the Mad Max type of stuff or whether it be just anything, dude. I mean, there's so much in here in this big old book that you'll never forget it. If you read this just one time, you will never, ever, ever forget this book. You will thank me for reading it, I'm telling you. This is probably one of the highest recommendations of a book I could ever give on my channel, on any of my channels. This is one of my favorite books of all time, probably my top 5, even possible top 3 books of all time. I love it so much, and I can't even tell you how many copies I've bought of this. I have like the original paperback from the like 80s. It has a cool like purple smoke and a demon face and stuff on the cover. It looks so good. I have that old cover from back in the day. I have this cover. I have the bigger paperback that's like $30 or whatever, $18, something like that. But man, it's so good. I would recommend this book above almost anything that I've read and talked about here on the channel so far. It is an iconic, powerful, again, very poetic. I'm a poetry writer sometimes. I used to be, more so than I am now. I respect something about that when somebody has a very lyrical way of writing, and McCammon just completely captures that. I think he has a more lyrical sense of writing than Stephen King does. Stephen King can really focus it sometimes when he wants to, but a lot of the time it's more of just casual, the way he writes, and I like that too. There's different styles of writing, and I like that. McCammon is very poetic and very direct, and I really enjoy that. Again, there's a lot of gore in here, a lot of fighting, a lot of gun violence and whatnot too. There is some rape scenes and whatnot. There are certain characters like Sheila that have some pretty horrific things happen to her. I won't talk too much about Sheila. I don't want to spoil where she comes into the story and whatnot and how important she is, but there's a lot of characters in here, man, and there's a lot of intense moments and a lot of beautiful moments amongst people that don't even exist that will touch your heart and you'll never forget it. It's been 10 years since I read this book, and I've always remembered it very fondly, and I love it. I think it's just one of the best books I've ever read. I could not possibly, again, recommend it to you enough. I think if you haven't read Swan Song, you're missing out. It'll be one of the biggest regrets of your life if you don't read this book. It really will be. It's a powerful read. It's a big old book, too. It'll last you a while, but, man, if I had had the time to sit down, especially when I read that first 400 pages and then I took a couple of months off to do some other stuff for my Goosebumps channel, Michael Goosebumps fan, which, in case you don't know about that channel, it's all about Goosebumps stuff. If I had not had to take out time to read more of those books for reviews on that channel and stuff, I probably would have sat down and read the whole book in a couple of goes, you know, because it was addictive, man. This is a hard one not to just read through entirely in one go. And it's also hard to do that, you know, because there's not enough time in the day. But man, it's a powerful read. Again, probably top 3 or 5 books of all time. Easily, hands down. It's not just extreme horror. Yeah, there's a lot of gore and violence and whatnot in it, but it's not just extreme horror. It's genuinely a well-written, well-paced book. I think it's probably the best paced book I've ever read in my life, easily. As much as I love certain Stephen King books, like Doom McKee, or like Bag of Bones, those are a little bit slower at times. This is so much more well-paced than The Stand, either version of The Stand. As much as I love the original version from 1978 I just reviewed the other day, as much as I love that version, I think this is a better paced book even compared to that, even though it's longer than that original version. The original version of The Stand is about 820 pages, something like that. This is longer than that and still moves faster and moves better, I think. The different kinds of things that happen in here amongst, like, for example, since there's no sun, they can't grow crops. People are starving to death. You have the nuclear stuff lingering around places. You have animals that are getting turned into monsters, basically. 2-headed beasts and having heads grow out of their groins and that kind of thing. I mean, there's some horrific stuff in here, man, that just, it's going to stick with you. If you read this book, you will never forget it. If they would ever make a miniseries out of this, respectfully so, not for political agenda, but if they would make a respectable, real adaptation of this book, people would fall in love with it. It would be like the best thing to ever happen since Mad Max when it comes to post-apocalyptic stories. I think that it would top things like this newer version of The Stand for miniseries-wise, even though I didn't watch it yet. I really don't want to. It's like a political agenda. But even so, I mean, this is just a powerful, powerful read, man. I can't even ramble about it even more. I don't want to spoil too much for you, so I'm going to stop. But when it comes to Swan Song by Robert McCammon, it's a great book. You're missing out if you haven't read this wonderful piece of art. This is straight up art. This is the best post-apocalyptic story I've ever read. I think it's unforgettable. It's a classic. It's an absolute timeless classic that I will defend until the day I die, that everybody should read this. This should be taught in colleges. It should. If you want to take a creative writing class and learn a lot, they should have to teach you this book. Because there's so much more in here that I've learned about how to tell a story and how to tell a big old novel. I'm not a novelist. I'm more of a short story guy. That's really all I know how to do. If you want to learn how to write a novel, pick this up. Especially when it's a big event like a post-apocalyptic or like a fantasy type of thing. This feels like a little bit of a fairy tale fantasy type of thing to it. But man, the ending of this book, it just, God, it'll affect you the rest of your life. Some of the things that happen in this book, and then the finale and how satisfying all of it is. It's a very, very satisfying end, and that's one thing I want to point out too as a comparison to Stephen King's The Stand. A lot of folks out there who are not like myself and not a Christian, they typically find the ending of The Stand as a complete cop-out and a waste of time, and it ruined the whole book for a lot of folks, I think. I personally love it. Like I said, being a Christian, I think it's a great ending. I really, really, really enjoy that ending. It doesn't feel like a Deus pull to me. The ending of this book is not like that. It's about as satisfying as an ending could get for Swan Song. If you want a really good, big old book with a really great ending to it, this is what you should pick up. I really think that. I've never read Lord of the Rings. I've heard it's great. I haven't read it before. I plan to one day, but we're going to see what happens with that. Not a big Lord of the Rings guy. This book will stick with you the rest of your life. You'll never forget it. I promise you. And if you didn't like it, I would be shocked. I've been begging my friend Austin, which Austin might be watching this video. Austin, I'm telling you, man, whenever you get around to reading this, I'm so stoked to see what you think about it. Even if you hate it, I just want to hear why. You know what I mean? This is one of those books I wish more people knew about and read, so I could have more conversations with people about this book. It just, man, it's so good. It's so, so good. I spent like yesterday reading like the last 100 pages, and I could not put it down. It flies by, dude. Seriously, you could be lost in this book for ages and never, ever want to come out of it. Man, it's so great. When it comes to Swan Song by Robert McCammon, if I had to rate the book on a 5-star basis, I would hands down give this a 5 out of 5. I'd freaking give it a 6 out of 5 stars because it's so good. I mean, it's just, it's so unbelievably great. There's no words for it. It's a timeless classic. You hear people talk about Harry Potter like that. That's how I feel about this book. I think it's a better book than Harry Potter, personally. The world building is fantastic. The gore is there for people like myself who are gore hounds. There's a lot of crazy, wild situations that happen. There's the Mad Max feel to it. I think it's right after Mad Max had come out, maybe even after the Road Warrior. I think that has a little bit of influence in here. I believe Road Warrior was before '87 when this came out, but still. What do you think about Swan Song? Do you love it? Do you hate it? Put your thoughts and comments down below. I would love to hear what you guys have to say about this incredible, unforgettable read. Again, probably my top 3 or 5 books of all time. I love the characters. I love the lyrical writing sense. I think that the visions are beautifully done. Usually visions are all kind of wacky and dreamlike, and those are like that too, but in a very creative way, involving that particular ring of jewels I mentioned that Sister finds. It feels like everything actually worked. It's a great example of a book that I would be willing to bet probably had an outline. You know, for people who don't like to use outlines, this is a great example of a book that probably had one, and there's a good reason to have that because it just works. It works better. I love the side characters in the book. I think just every person that shows up in this book means something. Every single chapter matters. The pacing is fantastically going on. It's not a slow down and take your time type of book. It really just moves, and it means something. It really does. Everything in this book means something. I love it so much, man. If you can't tell already, I love it tremendously. I think that it's probably the greatest book ever written, fiction-wise. I think it's just completely compelling. I think it's powerful. It might very well be my favorite novel of all time. I don't know. I don't want to say that 100% right now, but I'd kind of lean towards that a little bit. There are certain books out there like Max Lucado's The Christmas Candle that I also think are just incredible reads. Rumblefish by S.E. Hinton I think is an incredible read, one of my favorite books of all time as well. There are certain books out there like James O'Barr's comic, the graphic novel for The Crow, that I think is just a perfect book, pretty much. I don't know if any of those would be my top favorite, but this very well might be my favorite novel, at least my favorite long novel of all time. I would say it's easily that. But even so, what are your thoughts on Swan Song? Again, 5 out of 5 stars for me, even possibly a 6 out of 5 if you want to call it that. This is so wonderful. You should totally take out the time to read this and just drool over how perfect it is. If you want a great example of something that'll make you feel like crap because you can't write this kind of big old book, this will do it to you for you fellow writers and wannabe writers out there. Anyway, what are your thoughts on Swan Song? Put them down below. Thank you for watching, guys. What are your thoughts on this incredible book? What are your thoughts on Robert McCammon? It kind of bothers me people don't talk about him enough. I want to read more of his stuff, even though I have quite a few books on digital. I would like to read a lot more of his stuff just to see more conversation pop up on my channel about him, because I really love what he does. I think he has so many great ideas out here for books. Yeah, he's just fantastic writer. Fantastic writer. Anyway, what are your thoughts? Put them down below. Thank you for watching. God bless you. Goodbye.